everybody. Welcome. I know I think the other sessions are just ending, so I know we're going to have a few people joining us. It's been a long but really wonderful day. I'm Sarah Laskin from National Geographic, and I'm very excited to be moderating the panel on the future of forests. So we took a vote over breakfast, and we did decide that forests have a future, so I think that's a good place to start. But we do need to, we're done, yeah. We do need to hear a little bit about what that will be. So this session is limited to an hour, so we have a little bit less time. So I'm going to be quick on the introductions of our panelists. There's wonderful, many years of expertise and many more honorifics among them. But to my far left is Carl Pope, who is the chairman of the Sierra Club currently, and he spent 17 years, am I right, as its executive director. And even more impressive statistic is that during his career, he has overseen the protection of 10 million acres of wildlife. So I think that is an excellent place to start. To my immediate left is Tom Lovejoy, who I want to call the father of conservation biology. He has many different affiliations at this point. The Heinz Center, George Mason University, and we're really honored to have him as our first conservation fellow at National Geographic Society. So that's been excellent. And to my right is Sanjayan. He's the lead scientist at the Nature Conservancy. He's also a Cato Fellow here at the Aspen Institute, and he's on the faculty of the University of Montana. So he spends a lot of time not at home, traveling for all of the things that he does. And forest, yeah. So to get us going, thinking about what forests mean to you, I think if we polled the room, we would have many diverse answers. Forests are a spiritual place for some people. They're a place where biodiversity lives. We've heard a lot of discussion about that. They're a place that provides ecosystem services. Certainly, you can think of many of those. Interestingly enough, to some people, they're a commodity for business. They're a livelihood for local populations. And in some areas, people think of them as something that should be removed to make place for a land use type that they consider maybe a better use. What does that mean then for the future of forests? There's a lot of competing pressures on them. On the one hand, I think an area the size of Switzerland is lost each year of old growth to deforestation. You have lots of new plantings going on in other areas. How are those going to work? So I wanted to start off the conversation to Tom. In your career over the past 20 or 30 years for forest conservation, what do you think has gotten better, and what do you think has gotten worse, and where are we now?
Well, I guess you really need to look at it as a ledger with a positive side and a negative side. And I'm not sure I really have to dwell too much on the negative side because that's what gets covered in the media. Certainly, the great tropical forests of both South America and Southeast Asia have retreated considerably, and the African ones are beginning to feel the impact, and we could go on, in boreal forests and the rest around the world. But I think, the important thing is unmentioned almost entirely by the media has been the positive side of the agenda. And as anybody who knows me knows, I always go back to the place I know best, namely the Amazon, to sort of talk about this kind of thing. And when I first set foot in the Amazon in June of 1965, there was one road and 3 million people in the entire Amazon. And that's as big as the 48 states. So you've heard all about the negative side. At that time, there was one national park, I think, Manu in Peru, and there was one national forest and one demarcated indigenous reserve, the latter two in Brazil. Well, today, 42% of the entire Amazon is under some form of protection. So that's like 42% of the 48 states. And if you look at the Brazilian two-thirds of it, it's an even higher percentage. So the balance sheet continues. We continue to try and stop the retreat of forests and expand their protection, but protection also has to mean some use. So when I say under some form of protection, it means from traditional, completely protected areas to extractive reserves and other forms of protection.
We met this morning a little bit to discuss the panel, and one of the interesting things that Sanjayan had said was that there are more trees in the United States now, excuse me if it was the United States, than there has been in the past, and yet we talk about a forestry problem. And my sort of Orwellian comment was, are all trees equal? Some trees are more equal than others. So what are we really looking for in forest conservation when we're talking about making the best and most effective use of conserving forests for the future?
Right. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here, and appreciate it. So let's take the United States, for example. There's about 170 million acres of federal forest land in the U.S. That's an extraordinary amount of forests. Certainly since the time of the settlers, things have reversed, and we get more and more forests coming out because of planting efforts and things like that. I was just in Nebraska, in Omaha, and I really expected to see a lot of prairie, and I actually saw a lot of forest because that's where the Arbor Day Foundation's there. And it started a long time ago with this notion of reforesting what was going to be a dust bowl. So the forests are spreading in the U.S. for the most part, but those 170 million, let's just take federal forest lands right now, are really badly managed. And it's actually a huge threat to the condition of the forest, to your question of are all trees equal? They're not. And particularly out in the West, but throughout the United States, the Nature Conservancy, for example, has identified 24 major federal forests where we believe that there really needs to be massive spending in restoration, invasive species management, fire management, thinning, and so on and so forth. Now, you'll see some movement on this. Senator Tester, my senator in Montana, introduced a bill legislating a certain amount of cut in some forests because of forest management and health issues, as well as setting aside large areas as wilderness areas. That's a challenge because he's actually putting in a numerical target that had to be hit every year. As a scientist, I'd prefer that target not be there because you don't want to legislate, okay, you have to bring this many million board feet out every year and then tie the hands of the scientists managing it. But it's in the right direction. This notion of appreciation that even though we have federal forests out there, how we manage them is important. When you go outside the U.S., one of the most amazing things about forests is the case I have to make all the time is why conservation is important to the lives of people. Without that, it's not sustainable. Without that, it entirely depends on our ability to raise money in the West and ship it to the South and the East. Forests are one of the easiest examples to make an argument for in terms of local communities. You can make it through water, you can make it through timbering, logging, and better logging practices. You can make it through food and food security and so on and so forth. So forests tend to be one of those, forestry projects tend to be a better and easier sell to make when you're trying to convince local communities to think about conservation. On that note, on the logging side, and particularly tropical logging, much of the destruction that you see from tropical logging is not the trees that are taken out, but it's actually all the roads, all the infrastructure, all the tearing up that happens in getting to those trees. So changing logging practices outside the U.S., in Indonesia, for example, can have a huge positive impact on conservation outcomes.
Carl, so you had a very interesting comment this morning when we were talking about value systems around forests, valuing forests in a financial sense, and the comment you made this morning was that our economic system makes it harder than it needs to be. And I just thought that was a very interesting point I'd like people to hear about.
Okay. 1985, the Pacifica Lumber Company, located in Scotia, California, had every commodity speculator's wet dream. They had an effective global monopoly in a commodity, old-growth redwood, which was appreciating in price every year by about 11%. They had no debt, and all they had to do was sit back and cut 2% of their trees a year for the next 50 years, and they were going to make an incredible fortune. Enter leveraged buyouts in the person of Charles Hurwitz of the Maxim Company. Hurwitz comes in, says the problem with this business model is it's not being liquidated fast enough. They actually want to keep this asset for 50 years. It should be liquidated. He made a hostile takeover bid. The lawyer who represented Pacific Lumber in defending against the bid turned out actually to be the lawyer of Hurwitz's partner, Ivan Bosky. The company was taken over. The forest was liquidated. The community was devastated. And the shareholders, at the end of the day, made less money than they would have made had the old management been left in place. That would not happen today in parts of the world where forest land tenure is reliable and properly aligned. Because, in fact, people looked at that experience, and in particular, Jeremy Grantham's hedge fund figured out that the single asset class which has appreciated the most rapidly and the most consistently over the past 50 years is forests. They're actually the best possible investment for a long-term investor. And one of the reasons that the endowment portfolios of places like the University of Chicago and Harvard and Yale have done so well lately is that they have been invested as long-term investors very heavily in forests. So we know on the private market side that preserving forests makes tremendous economic sense. But that's not what happens in most of the world, because in fact what we see is not a world in which most forest tenure is firmly settled, properly defended, and reasonably aligned. The people who benefit from forests typically don't own them. The people who theoretically own forests often can't defend them. And it is not misleading to view most of what happens in the global timber trade as a form of militarized organized crime. 80% of the mahogany which is imported into the United States from Latin America is known to be illegally logged. 80%. So what I think we have to understand is the problem with preserving forests is not an economic problem. Forests preserved are worth more than forests destroyed. They are worth more to the societies in which they exist. Forests in Indonesia, the forests in Canada, which also doesn't actually have a rule of law when it comes to forestry, are actually worth more to those countries preserved than they are liquidated. But obviously, as with any criminal endeavor, it's more lucrative for the criminals to liquidate what they don't own than it is to allow those who do own the resources to maintain them. So the point I think we have to look at the global forest situation is say, how can we create globally a system in which those who benefit from forests own them, those who own them can defend them, and those who steal from them, instead of becoming rich, are punished.
Follow up, I guess, then on increasing pressures on forests for Tom. I think, especially in Brazil, which we've talked about a little bit, I know that there's a proposed change to the protection laws there, and there's a lot of continued pressure from agriculture, and at the same time we've heard a lot about population growth, the need to feed more people. Will the technologies in agriculture help us do that, or is it going to just be a land issue? And I wanted to hear a little bit about the situation that's going on there, and where do you think that's headed in the short term and even the long one?
So there is a major effort going on right now to weaken the forest code in Brazil, driven by certain agricultural interests who happen to have strong representation in certain committees in the Brazilian Congress and in the politics of what goes on there. And it has a lot of provisions. I won't go into all of them, but one key provision in the current code requires any landowner in the Amazon to leave 80% of his land in forest. And it's a really important thing to do because, as it turns out, the Amazon makes a significant amount of its own rainfall. It recycles moisture as the air masses move from the Atlantic to the Andes. Closer. Is that any better? A little better. So in any case, that really requires the forest to maintain that recycling of moisture. And when all that moisture finally hits the high wall of the Andes, a big chunk of it falls as rain, creates the Amazon River system. Some gets deflected north, and some goes south, where it's really important for agro-industry in Brazil and some of their hydroelectric operations. So if you don't have something like 80% of the forest intact, that begins to degrade. And I don't have time to go into why that really is a pretty strong case. But that's the issue at hand. But in the meantime, the battle is going back and forth within the Congress. I suspect that what's going to happen is that the Senate may make some minor changes to what the lower house has passed, but that the president will veto certain provisions in the revised code. But anyway, that's what's going on right now at a time when all 10 still alive environment ministers of Brazil have signed a document saying, it's a real mistake to change this code.
Keeping with the international trend and building off of what you were talking about benefits of forestry in the U.S., I know we discussed a little bit about the potential conservation benefits to improving poverty or for impoverished communities, and I thought that was an important point.
Yeah, and just one thing, and Tom knows this, but obviously, but one of the interesting things that's going on in Brazil right now is that there's also some talk of amnesty for people who have deforested.
Yeah.
And so there's this little uptick that has been noticed in deforestation after many years of going the other direction.
2 or 3 years.
2 or 3 years of going. It's many years. Fair enough. Yeah. So one of the most exciting things that I have found in conservation, and that we've really been pushing hard, is this linkage of conservation outcomes with human well-being outcomes. And in forestry situations, we've found a lot of resonance in particular projects that we've done. So in some of our projects in Latin America, linking water and water supply, where the users of water, the bottling company like FEMSA, along with Inter-American Development Bank money and others, go from the users, the municipalities, to the protectors of the watershed, similar to the system that you have in New York City, for example. And that's being spread out now to 30 other cities in Latin America. And I think that it actually ends up protecting lots of forest and grasslands in a very sort of clever way. The other part is in British Columbia, one of the things that I've been involved in, along with Carl and others, it's been one of the most amazing places to see a transformation of what forest conservation means. So when I was a graduate student, I got involved there, and there was a pitched battle between environmental groups like Sierra Club, like Greenpeace, and others with the timber industry. And it was a valley-by-valley battle. They want to log there, then you start a blockade there, and literally a physical confrontation, valley by valley. And it really came to a head when the environmental groups started pressuring the European buyers of that timber or the paper products. And that's when things started happening. Fast forward this many years to now, and you have a very different system up there. You have 21 million acres of coastal temperate rainforest, the only intact coastal temperate rainforest in the world. Still got grizzly bears, still got salmon, still got wolves, protected essentially. 7 million completely out of any kind of logging, any kind of mechanized activity, any kind of activity except ecotourism. The rest is under some form of ecosystem-based certified forest or ecosystem-based management, which is up for debate. It's not perfect by any means, but moving along in that direction. And there's a fund in place that allows 27 of about 30 First Nation communities to apply to that fund to get money to create jobs and activities that tie their livelihoods back to the land, back to that forested land and water. And because of that fund, partly because of that fund, First Nation communities have ceded control of a lot of forest lands into this agreement, the Great Bear Forest Agreement. So, that argument of using forests for other reasons than just timber, for water, for recreation, for hunting, and so on and so forth, is a resonant activity. And of course, the mother of all of these is the RED projects, which is about locking up carbon in places like Indonesia through forestry.
That's good. You perfect segue, because I know that all of you wanted to have an opportunity to discuss that. And I was actually going to go to Carl to talk about, is RED the next big idea in forest conservation, and where do you see it going?
Well, let's begin with, because we shouldn't fall into acronyms. RED stands for, I don't know what that
Reducing emissions from
Deforestation.
and degradation.
Okay. It came out of the...
Everyone together.
It's REDD.
And now it's RED Plus, REDD
Yes, so
Plus.
this is all very arcane UN speak. RED was an effort to take into account the fact that most of the people who have studied various things we could do to reduce climate degradation have concluded that by far the cheapest, the thing that gives you the most climate benefit for your buck, is protecting forests. Forest deforestation amounts for at least 20% of total global carbon emissions. It's probably actually higher in my own opinion, but that's the official statistic. And the cost of persuading the government of Indonesia, the government of Guyana, the government of the Congo not to log their forests per ton of carbon that you would leave locked up turns out to be much smaller than what you would have to pay to replace a coal-fired power plant with a solar power plant. It's just a lot cheaper. So something like RED is an absolutely winner idea. I personally happen to think that RED itself is probably going to have to be redesigned before it will work, because it was based on some of the compromises originally struck in Kyoto, in which there was a concept that was a 1990 benchmark, and you were only going to measure and hold people accountable for things they did that were different than what they were doing in 1990. Well, the world has changed a lot since 1990. The Congo would argue, I suspect, that under RED as presently designed, Indonesia gets a lot more benefit because it is cutting down its forests, right, and the Congo gets no benefit because it's not cutting down its forests, which is an odd way to reward virtue and encourage it. So my guess is that RED needs to be rehauled to really get the incentives aligned properly. Having said that, RED has another problem. It's based on the notion that there is going to be an international regime which prices carbon. Case not in point. I mean, that's not actually terribly likely. So I think we actually need to find another way to get the money to do this enormously economically and environmentally sensible thing, which is pay people to protect their forests. And I'm actually going to toss out a completely unvetted idea, which is wood is too cheap. One of the reasons forests are being destroyed is that wood is too cheap. Huge amounts of quite valuable wood are turned into shipping pallets, which are used once and then sent to the landfill to generate methane. We should make wood more expensive. And one easy way to make wood more expensive is to levy a global fee on the shipping of wood products, and to take the revenue from that global fee and putting into funding a revised version of RED. So there's one wild and crazy and probably bad idea.
Well, it really is important to figure out a major source of funding for RED. And, I mean, creative thinking like we just heard about is going to be really important. But in the meantime, there are some sort of lesser scale efforts going on, which are first steps in the right direction. So the California climate bill actually allows them to do some carbon payments with particular states in other countries, like the state of Amazonas and Acre in Brazil. So we can get there, do some experiments there. And even internally within the state of Amazonas, the government rewards communities that find ways to pursue their own aspirations by leaving the forest relatively intact. So there are early experiments out there. The only caveat I would just raise as a caution is that if we start to think about forests only as about carbon, we're missing a huge part of their value. So my little one-liner about it is valuing a forest only for its carbon is like valuing a computer chip only for its silicon.
Just very quickly on the red projects, the other big challenge is what they call leakage, which is if you don't log here, you're going to log somewhere else. So at the end of the day, there's a no net gain of locking carbon away. And that's a real problem, a real big challenge. That one, and also enforcement. So how do you monitor this? How do you make sure that countries are doing what they're saying? Unfortunately, where big tropical stands of forests exist also tend to be fairly poorly run. One approach is to do it at a scale where leakage becomes less of an issue. So we're tackling a provincial scale red project in Indonesia for the province of Barau. So trying to do it at that scale, you try to get rid of some of that leakage issue. There is money right now, though, on the table for some red work, $4.5 billion or so, which is an enormous amount of money, at least in terms of what forest conservation has traditionally attracted. So it's a hard problem. I agree with my colleagues here, but I still think it's a pretty good idea for getting big-scale forest conservation done. And of course, the notion of empty forests, Kent Redford and others have written a lot about it. Going into a forest and all the animals are gone, and you don't hear the birds sing, and the monkeys are gone, and the animals are gone. Everything's been eaten out, but the forest still stands. A dead forest, but from satellites, it still looks like a living forest. It's a very real and difficult problem to tackle.
Thank you. Carl, you mentioned a little bit about economic incentives in your for forest conservation. Do you think any of the certification programs that are starting out there are things that consumers can really rely on to understand if good forestry practices are in place, or is it either too early or unmonitorable, and is it just words?
Well, I think that certification, if it's well done, and some of the certification programs are better than others, give you the ability to consume a certain amount of forest product with a smaller ecological footprint. So they're good. And they do provide an incentive to landowners to manage their land better, sometimes quite a powerful incentive. But I also think it's really important to understand that somebody made this comment earlier, I think it was about seafood, that the best way to save the world's oceans is not to eat sustainable seafood, is to eat less fish. The best way to save the world's forests is not to buy sustainably produced wood, it's to waste less wood. Most of the wood we use, we waste. So we really need to figure out some economic incentives on the demand side. That won't solve all the problems. In places like Brazil, much of the clearing is not for wood. It's so you can do something else with the activity. So this is a complicated problem. But I think that we need to create a culture in which it's simply not acceptable to have bought a piece of tropical furniture and not to be able to answer the question, where did the wood come from and how was it grown and was it done legally and were the workers treated decently? It just shouldn't be okay to bring in a fancy new mahogany table into your house and have your friends over to dinner and nobody says, oh, where did this come from? We really need to create a much higher level of consciousness about our consumption.
So, Tom, moving into solutions, we've talked a little bit about RED, certification. Do you feel that in the conservation community, specific to forest or more broadly, that the game-changing ideas are already out there, even at some small scale, or is it is it now time to look for disruptive change among the best minds, either in the forestry discipline or in other areas?
Well, I don't think we're, ever have a sufficient number of great ideas. We've got to keep working at that. But having said that, I think, a lot of the solutions are out there. The issue is how to actually bring them to scale and to also bring it into public consciousness in exactly the terms that Carl was talking about, where people want to know, where did this table come from?
So I think it's a value system shift, and I think I believe you were the one who called karmic. It wasn't so much about it was a karmic value versus an actual value in conservation. And do you feel in the work that you're doing that you're seeing this either in the United States or in communities, that there is a shift in the mindset about how people value forests and the benefits of the ecosystems?
Yeah, I think so, and even in the U.S., I see it. We just did a survey of congressional staffers. It's a fairly decent survey, large sample size, both sides of the aisle, a whole suite of questions around forests, trying to gauge support for forest conservation. And surprisingly, of the different types of conservation activities that could be put out there, forest conservation was right at the top. Interestingly, it was around issues of forest conservation for ecosystem services and forest conservation for wildlife. It wasn't for climate reasons, so that kind of ends up falling out. But I do think in general, with forest conservation, you do have the education of the public. We're a little bit ahead on that one compared to, say, grasslands, in terms of habitat types. And I think that certification programs, even though like FSC, which is one of the higher levels of certification, is really not adopted by that many, has had a huge influence on policymakers because it has made it okay to ask the question, where does this stuff come from and what impact is it having? So even if when things aren't certified, that it has prompted that change. That said, I still think for the U.S., I think our federal forest lands and state forest lands are really managed still quite poorly. From an ecological perspective. You can just see it. Go on a hike out here and you'll see it.
And as a follow-up to that, do you think that change and degradation is happening in our forests at a pace that is so slow that the baseline shifts and people don't recognize what the new normal is? I was thinking about the neighborhood I live in, which is a city, but 50 to 100 years ago it was more farmland and there would have been more trees, but I don't recognize that. I'm only aware of the changes in forest that I see now.
I think in the West it's happening fast. I mean, unfortunately, it's happening ridiculously fast. And I do think landowners in the West actually see that. I have not gone into a Western community that has forests within its vicinity where I'm not immediately asked about pine bark beetle or what's happening to those forest lands or forest fires. And unfortunately, this shift is happening so fast that we don't have good solutions for it from a science perspective. Internationally, maybe I think Tom and others can probably address that better.
So, what do you think that?
Does it change? I mean, we're at 7 billion, and part of the conversation has been about population. Do you think that we're in a position to make some changes that will slow this down or correct it as we progress to 9, 10 billion?
Well, it's going to be very, very different from place to place. And, I mean, interestingly, even though this drama is going on about the forest code in Brazil, at the moment, public opinion is right where you would want it to be.
Yeah.
The media are right where you would want it to be. The church is right where you would want it to be. The scientific community is right where you would want it to be. And maybe that's partly because Brazil had the Earth Summit 20 years ago, and it dominated their media for weeks on end. It influenced school lessons. So you get some places where there's basically a pretty favorable national sort of consciousness about the issue. And then you get other places, where it doesn't even enter the mind because everybody's so poor and they've driven down the environment so badly. And I'm thinking of Haiti, right? And then you have enlightened places like Costa Rica, which had just about the first ecosystem services law. So you get a whole spectrum, but it is clearly, collectively, a much better outlook in terms of being able to do something and it being considered part of the modern agenda than it was, say, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I think there's a tipping point. I don't think we know exactly where it is. But in places like Haiti or Greece, which was once heavily forested, once the forest becomes degraded to a certain point, people can no longer see the ecosystem benefits of maintaining it, and it's too late. Nobody in Greece is thinking about serious reforestation. Nobody in Turkey, which used to be a completely impenetrable oak forest. Central Anatolia, if you read Xenophon when he tried to cross it, the biggest problem was cutting down the oak trees to get across with his 10,000 men. Places like the United States and India, I would argue, are kind of on the edge. There's a lot of primary forest, there's a lot of degraded forest, there's awareness that forest has values, there's some good public values. Places like Brazil, you may actually be better off because you've got really intact ecosystem services people can value. So one of the scary things about this morning's presentation about population was if you were to map the 18% of the world that's going to add 4 billion people. I mean, that really is part of the world that today has 1 billion people is going to add 3 billion people if those UN projections take place. And if you look at that and you look at where there's primary rainforest, Africa and most of Asia is gone if that happens. Indonesia may make it, India may make it, Brazil's okay. But a huge part of the world's remaining forest is gone if those population projections become predictions. Just because there'll be too many people in the Cameroons. I mean, they'll become Haiti.
So I have many more questions, but this session was called In Conversation, and I know we have about 15 minutes left. So you had the first hand up over there, and there's a mic over here, so and we'll let the gentleman with the leather jacket go first since he really had his hand up, but then if everyone can maybe queue up.
I really have a fundamental question. I have understood and been advised that trees, as they grow, have a net or a net sink for carbon dioxide. But once they're mature, they are neither a sink nor a source. But from what I'm hearing here, stable forests that presumably have as many dying as growing is a good thing. Is the really good thing to have new trees planted and growing? Isn't it the rate of change that's important?
So I think the important point here, let's ignore the fact that it does appear at the moment like a lot of the forests of the world, the mature forests, are actually growing a bit in response to elevated CO2. I'm going to ignore it because I think they're all going to run into a nutrient limitation at some point and stop doing that. But the really important point from just a carbon point of view is that you don't want that ending up in the atmosphere, right? So if one is really going to think about managing the planet, which is, my terminal quixotic dream, you want to maintain the standing stock in natural forests, but also do some active reforestation.
So if you cut it down, then it releases
That's right.
CO2.
That's right.
Because it usually just rots.
Right.
Right?
That's right. So take the Amazon forest at the moment. I've got my numbers right, and I may be a little off. It has, or the tropical forests of the world have roughly an amount of carbon in them equal to about half that in the atmosphere. That's not a good idea for us to let go.
But to get rid of some of the
So to pull some of the seed.
You want to reforest? Yes, you want to plant.
Okay, I guess I cleared it up. Thank you.
Six trees per person will take care of
So to
the
help
CO2.
clarify a bit more, roughly half of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere over normal levels has come from destruction of ecosystems over 3 centuries. And some of that can come back, still leaving room for agriculture and the other kinds of things that we need to use land for.
I've got a double question about tree plantations. And I used to be a logger, so I'm actually kind of attuned to some of these issues. And I would love to see wild trees cut less, and that keeps forests intact better than anything. And one of the ways that seems to happen is of the intense productivity that you get out of good tree plantations. So, in FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council is watching some of the tree plantations to be sure that they're properly logged and so on. So my first question will be, are plantations good in your view? My second question is, FSC does not pass judgment on any genetically engineered trees. They're, for some reason, against that. Doesn't make economic or biological sense to me, but what it means is I can't count on their judgment about the increasing number of plantations that are using engineered poplars and things, some eucalyptus now. So the second part of the question is, not only what do you think about plantations, but what do you think about engineered trees and plantations?
So
I can take a quick. So I think plantations are getting a lot better. Most of our scientists are favorably view forestry plantations. Not all perfect, and it depends if you're planting what you're planting where, obviously. But they are definitely getting better, and they certainly get rid of a whole host of mess about how to do the logging and how to do the extraction and all of that. On the second part, isn't there a case right now about American chestnut and genetically doing some genetic modifications for chestnuts in order to get it out, but it's stuck right now? It's actually a perfect example of what you're saying, where the rules are swayed in are written in such a way that it makes it impossible for us to rapidly create a chestnut that is resistant to disease, which is what we want to do using GMO technology.
Yeah.
And so, my own take is I think GMO is coming, and I think it's fine with some level of check and balances. So
Carl is leaning back.
I'm sure.
But,
but I'll put that there because
the case that I'm aware of is not chestnut, it's eucalyptus in the South, where they're making eucalyptus that can grow fast and productively.
No, there's a chestnut story right now.
Great.
Yeah, but there are already GMO trees in plantations.
Yeah.
It already is happening.
Yeah.
And the only thing I'll say about that is any technology can be used positively or negatively, and we need to be really sharp about some of the consequences. And we already know that some of the GMO crops actually affect the fertility and growth rates of insect life in streams. The stuff does get around. But you got to have plantations for lots of good reasons. And again, it's not an issue of yes or no, it's how. It's a good way to get a lot of production. It's a good way to take pressure off natural forests. Eucalyptus forests in the south of Brazil, the plantations are spectacular, managed very carefully. Many of those companies actually have a ratio between the amount of plantation forests they have on their land and the amount of natural forests they have on their land. And they find some economic value in doing it that way. So, yeah, we do need them.
Do you want to add to that?
Well, I just want to say that I think that there's this conversation that takes place about GMOs, which is about well-regulated, properly tested GMOs or no GMOs. And I think those are actually, neither of those is what we have right now. What we have right now is the relatively reckless use of GMOs. not properly regulated and not properly tested in many cases. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do it right, but it might mean that we should stop doing it wrong. But let's also be aware it doesn't take genetically modified organisms to create an unholy ecological mess. The Melaleuca, which are destroying the American Everglades, are not genetically modified. They were just introduced. So particularly in the cases of trees, getting the right tree planted in the right place can be as important as whether it's genetically modified or not.
I agree with that.
Two questions, not related. One on climate change. You talked about the role of forests as carbon sequesters, but you just briefly alluded to the bark beetle issue, and many of us who flew in, for example, saw the extent of bark beetle devastation in this forest right here. There is some research that is emerging that suggests that while bark beetle outbreaks have occurred for time immemorial, the extent of those outbreaks may indeed be related to climate change. Secondly, the length of the fire season is now about 78 days longer than it was just 30, 40 years ago. And again, while some of that is related to the poor forest health that was alluded to earlier and previous Smokey the Bear put out every fire practice, some of that also may be related to climate change. I guess I'd like your thoughts on the effects of a changing climate on forests and what that might mean for the health of forests, their extent, and what strategies, if any, there are, along with, of course, mitigation strategies to address those. That's question number one, and then I wanted to ask a quick question about ecosystem services.
Well, there's no question, I think, that the scientific case is tightening for climate change, having a clear sort of fingerprint on what's happening with the bark beetle. And I think, it's interesting, we should have been able to predict that, but of course we weren't thinking about it. We're probably going to see a whole set of similar things where the balance is tipped by climate change in favor of a pest. And so that makes the whole issue of managing forests and managing the world's biological carbon that much more difficult, which is, in the end, I think, an increasingly strong reason to address climate change now and to really limit it to something that's going to be less in flux and less of a management challenge.
I'll let Stan know. It's fine.
Okay. So the ecosystem services question is this. I know TNC has done a number of projects in South America.
Right.
There was a recent project in the U.S. that the Forest Service touts, its Forest Faucets project, and in Denver, in which the municipality of Denver is actually paying about $30 million to the U.S. Forest Service to do fuels treatment to protect their source water. And then the motivation that they had was after the Hayman fire in 2004 with 400,000 acres burned, the erosion that resulted thereafter so damaged their reservoirs and water storage system that it really motivated them to anticipate and prevent that from happening. But apart from that, there's been relatively few of these ecosystem service transactions, particularly as related to forests. So what is your perspective on the prospects that ecosystem services transactions will in fact expand, and what do you perceive as the current impediments, economic policy or otherwise? And thinking in the U.S. primarily at this point.
Mm. That caveat changes it. So the challenge, I see it as an engagement, right? So at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is get communities to care about the land in ways in which it makes sense to them rather than it would make sense to me. For me, I want a forest in my backyard in Missoula, Montana, because I like the fact that when I go for a walk out there, some big toothed-fanged animal could come out and kill me. But that's just me, and some of you could get that. But save the forest, something might come kill you is not the good tagline for conservation, I have found, unfortunately. So as much as so for us, part of it is how we engage with communities and asking them, what is the thing that really you care about most? Is it water? Is it security? Is it food? Is it medicinal plants? And so on and so forth, and then redirecting it in those terms. That's a little bit smoke and mirrors, you might say. Well, are they getting a better deal at the end of the day than clear-cutting that and really just giving them development? And the answer is we don't really know. And here's why. So we just looked at about 500 papers that are published around this notion of how you alleviate poverty or improve people's lives through conservation efforts, not just forests, across the spectrum. We looked at every paper that we could find. And less than 5% of those papers actually measured in any quantitative way the social impacts of that work. And then of those 5%, almost none, I mean a handful, would do before and after types of studies. So really the problem is, to this point, many of those stories are great just so stories. The evidence is just trickling in. It's better in fisheries, frankly, but there are some forest examples too.
Well, I've been given the, are you, yes, you're the last. Go. Please go.
A very short announcement. Building on the last questioner, I want to invite the panel and everyone here to a reception that two local environmental groups, For the Forest and the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies, are having tomorrow afternoon at 5:30 at a home on the West End, just about 3 blocks from here. And there are directions to that home in your little bags. It's easy to find.
Right.
And we'll be discussing the science of forest dieback and forest restoration in this valley and Colorado and across the West, and talking about some of those big fanged animals and its effects on them. So anyone who is interested in continuing this conversation about forests, particularly in Colorado and the West, please join us tomorrow afternoon.
And you've just proved my point that if you ask for one more question, you get invited to a party, so I appreciate that. Excellent. And we're perfectly timed. I want to thank the panelists. I know that it's really, really wonderful having them here today and such a big audience after a long day. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the week, and I know these guys will be around either right now or throughout the next few days to answer any questions you may think of as the rest of the discussion continues. So thank you all for coming.
So I totally agree with you about GMOs.